All right, it's going.
Because my I'm not play alone. I need to play with you. I don't play it. Yeah. No, I didn't play it yet. No, I don't play it yet. We can play in Friday.
You have workshops. Yeah, I should buy it. I bought the game for him.
Can you put that back here? You can probably put it right there.
Come on, we can. But if we play, we don't play. So why would I play? We play once and then
We can play it in the vicious time.
Yes.
Because Diablo is too expensive.
What do you think about my favorite activity on organization and stuff?
Is it still on sale?
I thought I had some good insights. Mm-hmm.
It should show you already have it. It won't show you.
The importance of at least getting to see each other physically.
But the thing is, you conquer China.
It establishes the, that you're working with a person instead of working with a name.
Yeah.
But he has not reached China.
Well, he's a computer. I
I
viewed it more as working with just a name,
He's part of Chinese history.
with this kind of fictitious identity of Jim Bob.
And even
If you've met Jim Bob, you know that he doesn't check his email often. Not that he's just ignoring you.
How long have you
I think
moved
that
to China?
should, like, China should like end at that point. Because when China, from my perspective.
That's exactly what I just said, that becomes Mongolia.
Like now we're all Mongolian descendants. Probably. But the thing is, it's not the
Well, how do
official
you know?
version. The official version is these kinds of parts. Right? You have something to say.
How was your project or spring break one that you're doing with your friend?
It went pretty well. My mother ended up coming in. She was one of the test
You
subjects.
personally?
Not me, but the Egyptians. My sister.
Yeah.
It was just doing 19.
Was it in
Donkey
India?
Kong was killed by us.
No. It was poison.
We did
No.
I don't know.
It's like,
use
he was
motion
fighting
capture
Egypt in one of the
technology
great
to
battles called
capture
Engaru.
people's movements.
And he was,
Okay.
and this was the last stop for him, and all his
It was
army
something that
was
took about 5
killed
minutes.
by.
Are you sure that's a real
So,
You
it
go,
wasn't
you
too
go,
bad.
yes. See his last battle, it should be in Egypt.
How do you spell?
Again, G-N-G-H-I-S.
What? My laptop is working.
G-N-G-E-N.
Stop doing it.
That's
The
fine.
leader is
Can you give him heart attack?
he's Egyptian.
Hey, no.
Who wants to volunteer their computer for Skyping?
Sparking.
Okay.
Is it just you can't get a password that works on that one?
It's not connected, it's connected to the network.
Oh, I don't, the mic's not working, but I have Skype.
So that doesn't, you don't have Skype. Does anyone else have Skype?
I have Skype, but would have to go through and make sure my computer would stay on the entire time.
All right, well, I'll just do it on me then.
Let's look at this later.
Yeah.
And then we find the significant sentence.
You're not gonna reach each other.
He was taught by Egyptian. Even if he's not even he's not killed by Egyptian guys, he's probably what Egyptian taught. He was.
Where's your adapter?
All over the country, all over the world.
And if it doesn't work, it has a little thing that you can plug in to,
Yes, he couldn't get into Egypt. We met him somewhere here. I don't know exactly, somewhere near from Iraq.
How did you do it? Try it now. Because back then, you see online.
Egyptian law.
No, that's like, it puts like 3 out of 10 effort, and you put it in like takeovers, it might be out and going out. Because back then, it's not just the external.
You have internal fragmentation
Because he
also.
was really old by then. And we were discussing about
The
who is the successor.
The very bad defeat that he had.
So we just have to
They will use that video.
Can you hear?
Yeah.
All right. If you go to dropbox.specialorange.com,
Email it to me.
I can't at the moment.
Okay. Let's see if I'm not logged into Dropbox.
No, you're not. Just go online. This isn't that Dropbox. Dropbox.specialorange.com.
It's just such, so much for a seamless connection.
So also for you all, if you go to dropbox.specialorange.com/VT, you can, if you want, there's this presentation in PowerPoint, PDF, and there's also a 3-up/VT, and that's good enough. You'll see the CSCW one.
Can you write it down?
Okay, so
Blackboard?
Dropbox?
No, on the Blackboard.
Dropbox.specialorange.com/VT, and then you'll find the CS one. Say that again.
Is it just the third one? There are 3 of them there.
What, whatever 5734 CSCW is the folder.
But there are a number of files there.
It's whichever one you choose. There's one in PowerPoint, there's one in PDF, and then there's also a 3-up presentation. So I'll just tell you to advance the slides as I advance them, since you're, I don't know if that exactly looks like it'll,
Could I see that again?
Cool, have you started?
Can
no,
somebody pull up Javier on Skype, or can you do?
he's right here with
Oh, okay.
her.
Yeah, in the same place. In fact, we have a two-screen thing going on where we look at the slides on Javi's computer and
Special orange
you online.
/VT, no, not special orange.
Okay. Sorry, that's the research.
Who is?
Great.
His son.
Hi,
His son is the
everybody.
one that was beaten up.
Hi.
He didn't even
Stare at the class.
It's the army, but with not 2 meters, right? Why not? Really?
Another view pointing towards the land.
The problem is I'm the only one with Skype, so
I have
you're gonna.
Skype too.
That tablet or something that's somewhat good.
We're 15 minutes into the class. I'm trying
Yeah, we
to
better get
focus
started.
on the class part.
You might turn it a little more depending on where you're gonna stand.
Yeah, I'm gonna also verbally advance you so you can,
Don't worry, we can see that. We can see your slides. I'll switch when appropriate. Just
okay.
I think we should put ourselves on mute.
This looks like, there we go. All right, so we're going to talk about the Wellman paper on social networks, kind of talk about what it is to be a social network, and then also social network analysis from an assessment point of view, and then the 3 key concepts: identity, coordination, and efficiency, and then Dr. Tater's famous question of so what? That's kind of what's driving this presentation today. Okay, so since y'all read the paper, I want to try and incorporate your thoughts into the presentation as well. So mine is an augmentation. So the first question is, what was interesting in the paper thus far? What did people find interesting about it? Anything that poked out, stood out about this paper?
Okay, if I could turn around and look at the class, I would say nothing. You know, what was the paper about?
The paper to me seemed to be about the comparison between social networks and computer networks and how they are equivalent and how they are different. The thing I found interesting, and I didn't know if it was that exciting, was the constant use of closely knit, densely,
That's bone.
yeah, groups and the sparse groups.
Okay, he talks about that a lot, yeah.
Mhm.
Was there anything else? Any unanswered questions? I'm on slide 4. Anything that you didn't feel Wellman addressed or you're unsure of from your own perspective? Because not everyone in here is a CS background. I'm a CS background. And as I mentioned in the last class 2 weeks ago, when I signed up for this, my at least initial scholarly approach to social networks was from Dr. Fox's digital libraries class. So I'm heavy on this social network analysis, but on the real nitty gritty, how to do it, setting up federated systems. So it was a very different approach from Wellman. And I want to know, are there any concerns that anyone had from their own experiences, or did his paper flow? Well, we'll keep that in mind then as I move forward. So the things he talked about, which kind of are in the paper, like you said, is this distinction between, or this focus on the dense bounded groups and the sparse unbounded networks. He didn't always say that a group is always dense bounded and a network is always sparse and unbounded, but for the majority of his comparisons, they are. I really like the distinction between the groups and the social networks, the idea that a group is tightly bound, and then a social network is a superset of groups, and then how they interact. My most favorite, though, is that it's kind of underlining in his writing that he comes from a stance where social networks began prior to being online. They were first offline. Wellman himself is a community member, but also studies communities. He's at the University of Toronto at their high school. He talks a lot about the patterns of relationships and focuses more on the patterns than the actors. This separation of work and community, there's not always this idea that you are one person with multiple facets. It's sometimes that you are separate, that you do live entirely in one social community, and then you have a completely different life in both reality or in a different social network. And then he used these 6 characteristics to evaluate the densely bounded groups and the networks from a social network analysis point. On to slide 6. So these are already in the paper, but I really like when he talks about the idea of a healthy community. What does it mean? How do you achieve this? And then for me, I had a problem with exclusivity. It doesn't talk about concurrent or multiple interactions when you're participating in multiple social networks. Because he does talk about how you can bridge the gap. You can bring one community to another. He mentioned a little bit from an organizational standpoint, like a seller or a purchaser. They are the external communications from the external portion of the community and the internal part. So summarizing the paper in a nice grid work, everyone loves those, right? Again, bear in mind, when I write a group here, it is under the general premise that a group is dense and bounded. And he talks about the boundaries, meaning it has this sometimes geographical boundary, other times it's organizational boundary. And then a network is generally sparse and unbounded. It's clear, especially when you put it in a table format, that when he talks about these computer networks, right, because he's trying to say that a computer network is clearly a social network because of these features and in these particular facets and attributes. You can see that multiple, and he talks about it, it supports both. Until you get down to strengths and relationships, where he says it can't support both. You have to choose either one or the other. You can either support groups or you can support social networks. You can't really support both. I think that's a very interesting distinction, especially how where he talks about the secondary relationships as a key difference. And then I think overall he does lean too much into email as being this all-encompassing connector between networks and groups in a lot of his explanations. So with what you've read from the paper, what from your own standpoint, next slide, I want to do a little exercise. I want you to take about a minute or two, and I want you to write your own definition of a social network. And there's some things that you can consider. Are you going to write your definition from a social network that you're a part of? Or one that you know of but you're not a member of? Is that going to influence your definition yourself? So go ahead and take a moment for it and write a little blurb about what you think a social network is.
Excuse me, I have a question. Can you
Yeah.
elaborate the last question?
So if you remember some of the metrics he talks about, like the boundedness, the range, some of the social networks may not be co-located, or they're co-located but in a temporal sense. So we share this idea that around a particular idea. And the idea of Dr. Luther's, the students that, or the artists share an idea. They're bounded around making art, making flash animation. So what is the place? What is the how is it situated? And in their case, it wasn't necessarily geographically restricted. About one more minute. Looks like most people are wound up. Is there anyone that wants to share what they wrote? Yeah.
So I always consider a social network as a graph. So the person who are participating inside a social network are the vertices of that graph, and the relation between all these people can be edges. So if I have more than 1 degree, like let's say you have the concept of LinkedIn, how degree away you are from the certain connection. In that way you can visualize it. Let's say I know you, but I don't know Dr. Tater, but I can get connected through you. So this is always a graph for me.
Okay. Anybody else?
For that, like a graph, but it's not always densely connected. It's kind of sparse. Like
Yes.
the term that he uses is sparse, and I would say it's unbounded most of the times. Social networks that we use are mostly unbounded, and they aim at being non-exclusive.
Can you repeat things or turn the computer, because we can't hear what people are saying.
Okay.
We can't make it out.
Yeah, they talked about actors within a graph, and then another one they tied to, correct me if I'm wrong, but LinkedIn, where it is a unbounded, very sparse network. Anybody else? Yeah.
When I think of a social network, for me in my head, Facebook has become the de facto. I mean, for me, Facebook is the first thing that comes into my mind when I think of a social network. So that was what I had in mind when I thought of a definition for it. And for me, a definition of a social network is as simple as connecting with the relevant people in my life that I might care about in the present or in the future or in the past.
Anybody else?
I think it's a congregation of ideologies.
A congregation of ideologies. Can you elaborate just a little bit on that?
Basically, people get together based on some common ground, and I think that makes that by itself is a definition of getting social in some sense. You want to be with people like you around you. So
I like that.
And kind of going a step beyond that, a relationship, the connections that you get through a social network, if you have to have that grounding before you can get beyond a certain point in your connection, in your closeness of relationships.
So Kristen said that you have to have a grounding before you can enhance your relationship, right?
Basically.
So on to slide 9, different definitions of social network. From Wikipedia, it's a social structure made up of a set of social actors and a set of dyadic ties between these actors. The Radcliffe Brown, he focuses on a social structure. Many of you, up until where we said congregation of ideologies, y'all were talking about computer social networks. And it's easy, because we are from the younger generation, for us to think of social networks as automatically being computer. But that's not what Wellman wants to help you remember. He says the de facto Facebook is a social network because it follows some of these principles of social networks that are offline. Here it's interesting that it brings it back all the way, unless you're talking about Adam and Eve, the original two, according to the Bible, that those are the only cases where a social network doesn't exist. Wolf says you see it as a set of links, generated structures. I like how you said it's the congregation of ideologies. It's your idea, and that idea flows into story. It comes about over time. It is not modeled as some of LinkedIn is, where they're trying to model how the world is. Those are two very different approaches. From these three, it's the connections. It focuses on the relationships between two or more nodes, people and or groups. Because remember, groups can be represented as a node in some of these graphs. It doesn't have to be necessarily a person. And then Wellman in the paper says it's a set of people connected by a set of socially meaningful relationships. So in the computational thinking class I took here a couple years ago, we did this kind of similar exercise and we picked out the most meaningful words. So on to slide 10, out of those we have structures and actors, relationship, persons generated. Flow processes is kind of an outlier and it doesn't meld with the rest of those key words. Groups, set, entities, and then a very important one, which goes back to your ideologies, it's meaningful. We are social beings, we are humans, we need this story to be told. And how we tell it is how the social network is structured or becomes structured following the generated idea. Yes?
What do you mean by flow processes on this?
So on the previous slide, which is here, what Wolf wants to talk about is they're looking at this from a very specific organization. It's a governmental organization. So they're saying, I give you the paper, and then my job is to make sure that the date, the name, and the payment is made. And then I hand it off to this person. And then this person says, okay, I'm to deposit the money, check that they've made the payment, and send an email. And then they send it on, right? So you have this chain of flow.
That is workflow of certain tasks, basically.
Right. And so what Wolf wants to do is focus on this because these processes come out of the necessity of the social network. And we need to focus on these processes in order to understand the structure. How do you define a governmental organization, right? You can say that the people in charge of your utility bill are very good at following particular
But that
processes.
doesn't come out of the social network. That comes out because of the efficiency in the process. That workflow is defined for the efficiency of the process. If we go back into the 1910s, when the Ford started that automation process or assembly line concept, that is just to get the things done quickly.
So Deborah and Javier, he's arguing that the flow processes is more focusing on efficiency than it is the definition of a social network. I see where you're coming from, but from Wolf's perspective, it's focused. That is one way you can identify the social network. Because even before Ford automated the assembly line, there were processes done for these social interactions, and these are the processes that he wants you to focus on. Yes, efficiency came about, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, about what does it mean to be efficient within a social network. Yeah?
Can you talk a little bit more about what Wolf means by a generated structure? Because I think that's really quite important in understanding how he talks about flow.
So if I were to, or give me a moment here, let me pull it.
Or if you want, I can. Yeah.
I think I got this. Let's pull from your LinkedIn example earlier. LinkedIn is a model social network. It is saying this is how the current business world operates. We're going to show you these links to help do what LinkedIn does. But what Wolf wants you to do is to say, from an anthropological standpoint, let's look at this entity. In his case, it was governmental and other businesses. You see that there is a need for something to be done. And out of that need, you generate these processes that help fulfill the goals and purposes of that network, of that social network, of that group of people. So a job, a place that wants to hire a new person, they say they need certain things. LinkedIn will streamline that and say, hey, if you hook up with us and you give us this information, we can then market your information to everybody because we're going to be that interface. But what LinkedIn has to do is it has to understand that many different businesses operate in very different worlds. From the small business that wants maybe a little bit more of an interpersonal, less rigid structure, to the big Google who says, yeah, you just fill out these 15 lines and it'll automatically import to LinkedIn's system. Yes, Kristen.
I was just gonna add in that a lot of this stuff makes no sense if you take out the people from it. Because what's the purpose of the flow process if it doesn't deal with, I'm making the relationships of the people further down or I'm making the lives of the people further down the process easier because they don't have to redo my
So
work.
you can always have the flow process in softwares as well, when the data flows from the one tool to another tool. That can also be modeled as a flow process where the people are not coming into the picture. So
But
it is like, yeah, it is their movement.
I think that's a very important thing, Kristen, that we didn't use I abbreviated some of these definitions. But I myself didn't even include people. And that's the social component of the network, which I'm now realizing I failed quite incredibly.
So quick question,
Yeah.
can robots have social networks?
Can what?
Robots.
Robots have
Let's
social
say we have a
networks?
really smart AI, so, because my definition of social network is you can have a social setting without people. So basically what I mean is you just contribute to the network and you consume from the network. Basically it's like P2P or BitTorrent, basically. So you based on your decision or do certain tasks based on the status of the network or whatever criteria you get from the network. So let's say in Facebook you post your photos or update your messages because you have certain friends on there you want to get reaction from them, right? So your action or this contributing or producing content basically is the purpose of this is to get feedback. So you consume these feedback. So basically this is what I mean by you can actually like get rid of people in this thing because let's say in the future 100 years later or some years later you have a network of robots that they can socialize. They can do self-maintenance and do stuff like that. Although they're programmed to do stuff at this point, but probably in the future they can have their own social network. So probably in the long run, people are not necessarily a part of the network, but the network itself serves a purpose for certain tasks.
So for Dr. Tater and Javier, he's wondering, he's bringing in the idea of AI and does that constitute a social network? I would say it doesn't. It would be a network, which is very much like how the web works, right? They communicate, but it's not a social network. If you get to the point of where they're the intermediary between the humans, then I would say they are a component of the social network between the people.
But it depends on how do you define socialization, right? So do you define, only?
I'll actually get into that. He
Right.
asked, how do you define a social, and that comes to the
So
identity
can a
portion.
bunch of dogs
I would like
socialize?
to say something if I can.
Yeah,
Sorry, which is that, like dogs are social, right? And I could give my dog a like the ball and tell the dog to take it to Steve, right? And in that way, the dog would be the intermediary between me and Steve. And yet the utility of the concept of a social network is not really to be found in that description. You know, there's something that's similar, and as there is something that you could conceptualize as similar if we actually had robots that were, you know, had AI, had significant AI. But again, what's the utility of the concept of the social network? And that really is about like people. And people in mediated communication is what Wellman argues.
So some problems that we have to deal with. Motivations aren't necessarily clear. We're on slide 11. George Simmel, from the 50s through the 80s, he wrote this idea of the stranger, and it's this idea that the person that's further away is actually a lot closer than you think, and the person that's closer to you is actually more of a stranger. And we'll see. What?
Also,
Let me give you some more clear examples shortly.
okay.
Just keep this idea that just because in one of the networks that someone has assessed that they are close to you, even if you yourself are